Harlem, New York. The spring of 1963. An FBI special agent working organized crime walked into the Red Rooster on 138th Street and delivered an ultimatum to Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful black crime boss in America. Cooperate with federal investigators on Italian Mafia operations in Manhattan, or face immediate indictment on narcotics conspiracy charges that could put him away for 20 years. Johnson, then 56 years old and coming off his most lucrative year in the policy racket, an estimated $1.2 million in annual skim, did not cooperate. He did not negotiate. According to multiple witnesses in the restaurant that afternoon, he leaned across the table, looked the agent in the eye, and said something that made the federal man go pale. 48 hours later, that same FBI agent received transfer orders. He was reassigned to the Bureau's field office in Butte, Montana, 2,000 miles from Harlem, 2,000 miles from his career trajectory, and 2,000 miles from whatever he thought he knew about power in New York City. By the end of that week, word had spread from the Apollo Theater to the Lenox Lounge, to the brownstone steps where numbers runners collected slips every morning. Bumpy Johnson had moved an FBI agent off the board like a chess piece. And the question that haunted federal law enforcement, the NYPD, and every rival crew in 5 boroughs was simple and terrifying. How? This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, and widely circulated accounts. Some details vary across sources. The confrontation began not in the Red Rooster but 3 days earlier, in the 4th-floor offices of the Southern District of New York, where Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau was building a racketeering case against the Genovese crime family. The federal government needed leverage. They needed someone on the inside of Harlem's underworld who could testify to how Italian syndicates were using black neighborhood policy operations as cash pipelines, washing heroin profits, skimming percentages, controlling distribution. Bumpy Johnson was the logical target. He was known. He was connected. And crucially, he had done time before, a 10-year stretch in Alcatraz in the 40s, where he'd become close with the likes of Frank Costello's associates and developed a working relationship with Italian mobsters that was rare for a black operator in that era. The feds believed he could be flipped. They were wrong. Special Agent Thomas Callahan, 38 years old, Harvard Law graduate, 6 years with the Bureau, was assigned to make the approach. Callahan had a reputation as a smooth talker, a negotiator who understood that organized crime prosecutions were built on deals, not bullets. On the afternoon of May 14, 1963, he walked into the Red Rooster with a leather briefcase and no backup. Johnson was sitting in a corner booth with 2 associates whose names were never recorded in any official report. Callahan slid into the seat across from him. Witnesses, waitstaff, regulars at the bar, later told investigators that the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Callahan laid out the offer: immunity on pending charges, witness protection if needed, and a federal stipend. In exchange, Johnson would provide testimony and documentation on how the Genovese family was using him as a conduit for heroin distribution in Harlem and the Bronx. Johnson listened. He did not interrupt. When Callahan finished, Johnson reportedly said this: "You think you can walk into my place, in my neighborhood, and tell me who I work for and who I talk to? You think your badge means something up here?" Then, according to the most widely circulated account, he leaned in close and added a second line, a line whose exact wording has never been confirmed but whose effect was immediate. One witness described it as a threat wrapped in a history lesson. Another said it was something about knowing people who know people. A third, a bartender who worked the Rooster for 20 years, told a reporter in 1971 that Johnson mentioned a name, someone in Washington, someone with pull, but refused to say who. Callahan stood up, briefcase still closed, and walked out. He did not file a report that day. He did not return to the Red Rooster. And when he arrived at his office on May 16th, 48 hours later, there was a memo from the deputy director's office waiting on his desk. Subject line, immediate reassignment. Effective date, May 20th. Destination, Butte, Montana. Organized Crime Unit, Regional Support. No explanation, no appeal process. Just a plane ticket and a career detour that would last 3 years. Tuesday, May 14th, 2:45 p.m. Agent Callahan exits the Red Rooster. He walks 4 blocks south to a payphone on Lenox Avenue and makes a call to his supervising agent at the Southern District office. The conversation lasts 90 seconds. No recording exists, but phone logs confirm the call. Callahan does not file a contact report, a violation of standard bureau protocol. Tuesday, May 14th, 6:30 p.m. Johnson meets with 3 men at the Lenox Lounge, a known gathering point for Harlem's policy bankers and street bosses. Witnesses identify one of the men as Junie Bird, Johnson's longtime lieutenant and enforcer. The other 2 remain unidentified in police surveillance logs. The meeting lasts 2 hours. No violence, no raised voices, just conversation, drinks, and what one observer later described as a lot of phone calls. Wednesday, May 15th, 9 a.m. A call is placed from a payphone in Harlem to a private line in Washington, D.C. The number belongs to an office in the Executive Office Building, adjacent to the White House. The call lasts 11 minutes. Phone records from a 1972 congressional subpoena confirm the connection but do not identify the recipient. The context of this call would become the subject of speculation for decades. Wednesday, May 15th, 11:20 a.m. Agent Callahan receives a message to report to his field supervisor's office immediately. He complies. The meeting lasts 15 minutes. Callahan leaves visibly shaken, according to a receptionist who later spoke to internal investigators. He makes no further official contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office that day. Wednesday, May 15th, 3:00 p.m. A memo is drafted in the office of J. Edgar Hoover, Director of the FBI. The memo, partially declassified in 1998, references personnel adjustments in the New York field office related to operational security concerns and sensitivity of ongoing investigations. Callahan's name does not appear in the declassified portion, but the date and office of origin match. Wednesday, May 15th, 7:45 p.m. Johnson is seen entering the Teresa Hotel on 125th Street, the so-called Waldorf of Harlem, where he maintained a semi-permanent suite. He is accompanied by a man in a dark suit whom building staff do not recognize. The man carries no briefcase, no visible credentials, and stays for less than 30 minutes. Security logs list him as guest, no name. Speculation has ranged from mob attorney to political fixer to intelligence operative. No confirmation exists. Thursday, May 16th, 8 a.m., Agent Callahan arrives at his office to find the reassignment memo on his desk. The orders are immediate and non-negotiable. His supervisor, later interviewed during an internal review, stated that the directive came from above, meaning Washington, and that no local justification was provided. Callahan is given 72 hours to clear his cases and report to Butte. Thursday, May 16th, 10:30 a.m. News of the transfer spreads within the Southern District. Assistant U.S. Attorney Morgenthau convenes an emergency meeting with senior prosecutors and FBI liaisons. The meeting's contents are not recorded, but participants later describe it as tense and confused. Morgenthau reportedly demanded an explanation from the Bureau. None was provided. Thursday, May 16, 2 p.m. On the streets of Harlem, word travels fast. Policy runners, bar owners, street captains, everyone connected to Johnson's network begins hearing the same story. The Fed who came for Bumpy got shipped out. The details vary. Some say Johnson made a call. Some say he knew something. Others insist it was the Italians protecting their ally. But the conclusion is universal: you don't touch Bumpy Johnson. Thursday, May 16, 6 p.m. A coded message is intercepted by NYPD intelligence from a wiretap on a Genovese family social club in Little Italy. The message, translated from Italian street slang, references the Harlem situation and notes that it's been handled. The implication is unclear. Did the Mafia intervene on Johnson's behalf? Did they pressure federal authorities? Or were they simply acknowledging that Johnson had his own channels? Investigators never determined the answer. Friday, May 17th. Morning. Callahan clears his desk. He speaks to no one. Colleagues describe him as shell-shocked and bitter. One agent recalls Callahan muttering, "I was doing my job." Another remembers him saying, "This doesn't make sense." He boards a flight to Montana on May 20th and does not return to New York for 3 years. Friday, May 17th. Evening. Johnson is seen at the Apollo Theater, attending a performance by James Brown. He sits in a front-row booth, visible to everyone. It is a calculated appearance, a statement. Harlem sees him. The feds see him. The message is clear: he is untouchable, unmoved, and still very much in control. By the weekend, the story of the FBI agent and the 48-hour transfer has become legend. And in the world where reputation is currency, Johnson's value has just gone up. To understand how a black crime boss in Harlem could force the hand of the FBI in 1963, you must first understand who Bumpy Johnson was. And more importantly, how he became the rarest thing in American organized crime: a man both sides needed. Side A: The Rise of Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905. He moved to Harlem as a teenager during the tail end of the Great Migration, when hundreds of thousands of black Southerners were flooding into northern cities looking for work, safety, and opportunity. Harlem in the 1920s was a paradox: culturally vibrant, economically desperate, and controlled by white and Italian mobsters who ran the numbers racket, the speakeasies, and the protection schemes. Johnson started as a runner, a street-level operative collecting betting slips for a white-controlled policy bank. He was smart, ruthless, and disciplined. By the early 1930s, he'd earned the attention of Stephanie St. Clair, the Creole French numbers queen who ran her own independent operation and was one of the few black figures who refused to bend to Italian control. St. Clair took Johnson under her wing. She taught him the economics of the racket, the importance of political connections, and the art of playing white and Italian power structures against each other. When Dutch Schultz, the violent Jewish mobster, tried to take over Harlem's policy banks by force in the mid-30s, Johnson became St. Clair's enforcer. He earned his nickname Bumpy from a thick scar on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. But the name also fit his reputation: a man who disrupted, who didn't smooth things over, who made waves. Johnson went to prison twice. The first stretch was for a botched armed robbery in 1937, 2 years upstate. The second was the big one, conspiracy to sell heroin, 1951, 10 years in Alcatraz. It was during that second sentence that Johnson's mythology truly solidified. In Alcatraz, he bunked near mobsters, political prisoners, and stone-cold killers. He read voraciously history, philosophy, law. He studied Italian crime families. He built relationships. And crucially, he learned that the Mafia's power came not just from violence, but from connections, judges, cops, politicians, union bosses. When he was released in 1963, just months before the confrontation with Agent Callahan, Johnson returned to Harlem not just as a gangster but as a statesman of the underworld. By 1963, Johnson controlled an estimated 40% of Harlem's policy operations. His take was a clean $1.2 million a year. He employed hundreds of runners, collectors, and enforcers. He owned property. He funded community programs, paid rent for struggling families, and donated to churches. To many in Harlem, he was a Robin Hood figure. To the NYPD and the feds, he was a criminal they couldn't quite nail down, too careful, too connected, too beloved. Side B. The federal government's dilemma. The FBI in 1963 was an institution at war with itself. Director J. Edgar Hoover had spent decades denying the existence of organized crime as a national threat, focusing instead on communists, civil rights activists, and so-called subversives. But by the early 60s, the evidence was undeniable. The Appalachian Meeting of 1957, where law enforcement stumbled onto a gathering of over 100 mafia bosses in upstate New York, had blown the lid off the lie. The Kennedy administration, led by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, made dismantling the mafia a top priority. Hundreds of agents were reassigned, wiretaps multiplied, pressure mounted. But there was a problem. The Italian Mafia had learned to insulate itself. They used intermediaries, cutouts, and ethnic neighborhood bosses to handle the dirtiest work, especially narcotics. Harlem was a perfect example. The Genovese family, one of New York's 5 families, controlled heroin importation and distribution but rarely touched the product themselves. They used black operators like Johnson to move weight, manage street dealers, and absorb risk. If a bust happened, it was a black man who went down. The Italians stayed clean. To break this system, the feds needed someone on the inside who could testify to the arrangement. Johnson was ideal. He'd worked with the Genovese family for years. He knew shipment schedules, payment structures, and names. But flipping him was never going to be easy. Johnson had no incentive. He was making millions. He had status. And critically, he had leverage the feds didn't fully understand. Johnson's leverage came from years of careful relationship building, not just with mobsters, but with politicians, judges, and power brokers in Washington. Harlem was a Democratic Party stronghold. Black votes mattered in New York, and New York mattered in national elections. Johnson had funneled money into local campaigns. He'd helped get people elected. He knew who owed whom. And in 1963, during the height of the civil rights movement, the optics of a high-profile federal prosecution of a black community figure who many saw as a benefactor were complicated, to say the least. There's also the question of intelligence operations. Declassified documents from the 1970s revealed that the CIA and FBI occasionally used organized crime figures as assets, particularly in operations involving Cuba, labor unions, and foreign governments. Johnson's name appears in the margins of a few such documents, never as a confirmed operative, but as someone who may have provided information or maintained contacts useful to U.S. interests. Whether Johnson was an active informant, a passive source, or simply a man who knew how to hint at connections he may or may not have had, remains unclear. What is clear is this: when Agent Callahan walked into the Red Rooster with his briefcase and his ultimatum, he was operating on the assumption that Johnson was just another gangster who could be squeezed. He didn't account for the possibility that Johnson had made himself indispensable to people far more powerful than a field agent from the Southern District. And within 48 hours, Callahan learned the hard way that in the world of 1960s organized crime and politics, power didn't always come from a badge. To understand why Bumpy Johnson was worth protecting, and why the FBI wanted him so badly, you must understand the policy racket, the economic engine that fueled Harlem's underworld and generated millions in untraceable cash every year. Policy, also called the numbers, was an illegal lottery system that operated in nearly every black urban neighborhood in America during the mid-20th century. The mechanics were simple. Every day, players would bet small amounts, nickels, dimes, quarters, on a 3-digit number between 0000 and 999. The winning number was typically derived from a public source that couldn't be manipulated, the last 3 digits of the total handle at a local racetrack, or the last 3 digits of the U.S. Treasury balance published in the newspaper. If your number hit, you won. The payout was usually 600 to 1. Bet a dime, win $60. For players, the appeal was obvious. It was cheap, daily, and accessible. You didn't need to go to a casino or a track. A runner came to your door, your workplace, your corner. And unlike state-run lotteries, which didn't exist in most states until the 1970s, policy was immediate, local, and social. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. For operators like Bumpy Johnson, the economics were staggering. Let's break it down with a simplified example. Assume a single Harlem policy bank handles 10,000 bets a day at an average of 50 cents each. That's $5,000 in daily handle. The odds of any 3-digit number hitting are 1 in 1,000. Statistically, the bank should pay out around $3,000 a day in winnings, 600 to 1 on roughly 5 winning tickets. That leaves a $2,000 daily margin. Multiply that by 30 days, $60,000 a month. Multiply by 12, $720,000 a year. And that's just one bank. Johnson ran multiple operations across Harlem and had points in others. His estimated annual skim of $1.2 million was not an exaggeration. It was a conservative estimate. But the real genius of the policy racket wasn't the margin. It was the cash flow. Every single transaction was off the books. No taxes, no receipts, no paper trail. It was the perfect vehicle for laundering other income, particularly heroin profits. And this is where the Italian Mafia entered the picture. By the 1960s, the Genovese and Lucchese crime families controlled heroin importation into New York through their connections in Sicily and Marseille. But heroin was risky. It drew federal heat. It required street-level distribution networks that exposed high-ranking mobsters to arrest. So the Italians outsourced. They provided product to black operators like Johnson, who had the infrastructure, the trust, and the street credibility to move weight in their own neighborhoods. In exchange, the Italians took a percentage, sometimes as much as 40% of gross revenue, and they got access to the policy banks as a laundering mechanism. Here's how it worked. Heroin cash came in dirty, in small bills, from street sales. That cash was funneled into the policy bank as bets. The policy bank then paid out winnings in clean money which could be deposited in legitimate accounts or used for real estate, business investments, or payoffs. On paper, it looked like gambling revenue. In reality, it was a full-scale washing machine for narcotics profit. Johnson's role was critical. He wasn't just a policy banker. He was a bridge between two worlds, the Blackstreet economy and the Italian syndicate. He moved money. He managed risk. He absorbed heat. And in exchange, he got rich and earned a level of protection that few black criminals in that era ever achieved. This is why the feds wanted him. Flip Johnson, and you expose the entire pipeline. Show how Harlem's policy operations fed mafia heroin networks, and you build a racketeering case that could take down capos, soldiers and money men across three families. Johnson was the keystone, and he knew it. The response to Johnson's move and Callahan's sudden transfer split along predictable lines, revealing the deep contradictions in how power, crime, and community intersected in 1960s Harlem. Federal authorities, frustration and silence inside the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office. The reaction was confusion bordering on fury. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau, who had personally greenlit the approach to Johnson, demanded answers from the Bureau. He got none. The official line, delivered through intermediaries, was that Callahan's reassignment was a routine personnel decision unrelated to any specific case. But no one believed it. Internal memos, later obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, show that several agents questioned the timing. One memo, dated May 20th, 1963, notes, "The appearance of external influence in the reassignment of S.A. Callahan has created morale concerns within the field office and raised questions about case independence." But the questions went nowhere. Hoover's FBI was a closed system. The director did not explain, he did not justify, and agents who pushed too hard found themselves in career purgatory. The message was clear: move on. Within weeks, the Southern District's case against Johnson was quietly shelved. No indictment, no grand jury. The investigation into his ties with the Genovese family continued in name only, a file that gathered dust in a cabinet until the early 70s. The NYPD, complicity and impotence. The New York Police Department's reaction was more complicated. By 1963, the NYPD had a long and well-documented history of corruption in Harlem. Beat cops took payoffs from policy bankers. Precinct commanders looked the other way. Detectives sold information. Johnson had been paying protection money for decades, and everyone knew it. So when news spread that a federal agent had been transferred after confronting Johnson, many cops simply shrugged. One retired detective, interviewed in a 1975 oral history project, put it bluntly, Bumpy owned half the department. Why would we be surprised the feds couldn't touch him either? But there was also resentment. Honest cops, and there were some, hated that men like Johnson operated with impunity while they risked their lives for a paycheck. The transfer of Agent Callahan became a symbol of a larger rot, proof that the system was rigged, that connections mattered more than evidence, and that certain people were simply above the law. The Harlem community, fear, respect, and dependence in Harlem itself, the reaction was layered. For many residents, Johnson was a protector. He kept outside gangs from moving in. He provided jobs. He settled disputes without involving police, who were often seen as hostile occupiers rather than public servants. When word spread that Johnson had outmaneuvered the FBI, it reinforced his legend. He wasn't just a gangster, he was a power broker who could stand toe-to-toe with the federal government and win. But there was also fear. Johnson's power came from violence, and everyone knew it. People who crossed him disappeared. Witnesses went silent. Rival operators were found dead. The same man who paid your rent could also order your execution, and the fact that he could move an FBI agent off the board only confirmed what many had long suspected. There was no authority higher than Bumpy Johnson in Harlem. Not the cops, not the feds, not anyone in the days following Agent Callahan's transfer. Speculation ran wild. What would the feds do next? Would Johnson push his luck? Would the Italians intervene to protect their interests? 3 scenarios emerged, each with its own logic, risks, and consequences. Scenario 1. Retreat. The federal government quietly backs off. No new indictments, no new approaches. Johnson continues operating his policy banks and his heroin pipeline, untouched. The U.S. Attorney's Office pivots to other targets, lower-level dealers, street crews, anyone who doesn't have Johnson's connections. This scenario is plausible because the feds have limited resources, infinite targets, and a growing realization that Johnson is too insulated to flip. The cost: embarrassment for federal law enforcement, confirmation that certain criminals are untouchable, and a green light for other operators to build similar protective networks. But it avoids a protracted legal battle the government might lose, and it prevents a public spectacle that could expose uncomfortable truths about how organized crime and politics intersect. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement behind closed doors. A deal is brokered. Johnson agrees to limit his heroin involvement, or at least to avoid any activity that draws federal heat. In exchange, the policy operation continues unmolested, and no indictment is filed. This scenario requires intermediaries, lawyers, political fixers, perhaps even mob attorneys acting as go-betweens. It's plausible because both sides have something to lose. The feds want to avoid the appearance of impotence. Johnson wants to keep earning. A quiet understanding, never written down, never spoken aloud in official channels, allows both sides to move forward. The cost: moral compromise, institutional corruption, and the perpetuation of a system where justice is negotiable. Scenario 3. All-out escalation. The FBI, stung by humiliation, doubles down. They assign a new team, expand surveillance, pressure Johnson's associates, and build a case from the ground up. They bring in IRS agents to audit his finances. They flip lower-level operators. They make it clear that Johnson's move has only made him a bigger target. This scenario is plausible because institutional pride matters, and the Kennedy administration's anti-mob push demands results. The cost: years of investigative work, significant resources, and the risk that Johnson's political connections will intervene again. It also risks sparking violence. If Johnson feels cornered, he might lash out, and Harlem could become a war zone. But it preserves the principle that no one, not even Bumpy Johnson, is beyond the reach of the law. Within 72 hours of Agent Callahan's transfer, a new development shifted the equation. On the evening of May 19, 1963, a mid-level policy banker named William Shepard was found dead in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. Shepard had worked under Johnson for 6 years, managing collections in the Sugar Hill neighborhood. His death was ruled a heart attack by the medical examiner. But people in the street knew better. Shepard had been talking, not to the feds, at least not officially, but to someone. Rumors circulated that he'd been skimming, or that he'd made contact with an NYPD organized crime unit looking to build leverage against Johnson. The timing was impossible to ignore. Within a week of the confrontation at the Red Rooster, within days of a federal agent being reassigned under mysterious circumstances, a man in Johnson's inner circle turns up dead. Coincidence? Investigators didn't think so. But no evidence tied Johnson to the death. No witnesses came forward. No weapon was recovered. The case went cold within a month, but the message was received. Anyone thinking about cooperating with the authorities now had a very clear example of what could happen. The feds lost their best chance at building a case from the inside, and Johnson's reputation, already formidable, took on a darker, more final edge. He wasn't just connected. He wasn't just untouchable. He was willing to eliminate threats before they materialized. The streets of Harlem understood. The NYPD understood. And somewhere in a cramped office in Butte, Montana, Agent Thomas Callahan understood too. By the end of May 1963, the situation had crystallized into an uneasy stalemate. The federal government, embarrassed but unwilling to concede defeat, shifted its focus to other mafia targets. Johnson continued running his empire, more cautious but no less powerful. And in the background, the larger forces of history were already moving. The civil rights movement was accelerating. Malcolm X was preaching a few blocks away. Federal scrutiny of organized crime was intensifying. Harlem itself was changing, economically and politically. The world that had allowed a man like Bumpy Johnson to thrive was beginning to crack. But in the immediate aftermath of the Red Rooster confrontation, one thing was certain: Johnson had won. He had faced down the FBI and walked away untouched. He had demonstrated that power in America wasn't just about badges and laws. It was about relationships, leverage, and the willingness to use both. Whether he'd made a phone call to Washington, or leveraged a mafia connection, or simply bluffed so convincingly that the feds blinked first, the result was the same. An agent was transferred, a case was shelved, and a legend was born. The deadline that loomed over Harlem in the spring of 1963 wasn't a clock counting down to a court date or a raid. It was something more existential. How long could a man like Johnson operate in the gaps between law and power? How long before the world changed enough that his connections no longer mattered? The answer would come, in time. But in May of 1963, Bumpy Johnson stood at the height of his power, and the FBI could do nothing but watch,